Welcome, everyone. It's lovely to see so many people here today with us. My name is Gerrit Skafsma. I'm from the University of Amsterdam, where I'm a PhD student. And today it is my great honor to introduce Professor Kevin Young, who is joining us today to discuss his book, Levers of Power and Climate Change and System Change. And Professor Young is based at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and he is going to talk to us about collective action and climate change. His main research interests and teaching interests are in modern Latin America, and his book, Blood of the Earth, Resource Nationalism, Revolution, and Empire in Bolivia traces Bolivian struggles over mineral and fossil fuel resources in the 20th century. So he's written widely about leftist movements, especially in Latin America. For our purposes, most importantly, he has written this book, Levers of Power, which is an incredible piece of scholarship that studies the strategies that social movements can use to achieve their progressive agenda. And the way that we're going to sort of run things today is we're going to have Kevin give us a bit of an introduction to the book. Then I'll have a couple of questions for Kevin, and we'll have a bit of a back and forth for about 15-20 minutes. And then we're going to open the floor to questions from the audience, and we'd love to hear from all of you. So you can give us your questions in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function when we get to that stage of the discussion. Right now, it's time for me to hand over to Kevin. Thank you very much for being here.
Right. Thank you, Gerrit, and thank you very much for organizing this. I'm really grateful for this invitation, and I'm grateful that so many people have shown up. And I was saying before everyone else came on that the most exciting part for me is going to be hearing other people's input in response to what I'm saying. So I'm talking about political power, and that's something that I'm sure everyone has some thoughts on. So I'm looking forward to the last part of the session in particular. I'm sure that there's going to be stimulating questions and comments that will help me sharpen my own ideas. So I'll say a little bit about the book and my current work, and the book is essentially an attempt to understand the roots of political power, both the power of the forces who are aligned with the status quo and trying to protect the status quo, and those who want to do something different. So maybe 60% of the book or so deals with the power of the capitalist class. What are the roots of capitalist political power? And in the US context, at least, the conventional explanation for capitalist power is basically money in politics specifically. So campaign donations and lobbying. And that's certainly one important manifestation, or one important lever of business power. But in the book, we try to go deeper than that and emphasize the structural origins of business's political power as well. Underlying that exercise of power in the political sphere is business's structural control over the economy. Capitalists and investors control the allocation of capital, which means the availability of jobs, the availability of credit and loans, investment in housing, in services, in the production of certain goods over others, and of course, as you know, the production of environmental pollutants. So in all of these ways, investment decisions are central to all of our lives. Although most of us have virtually no or absolutely no power to directly affect those decisions. And at the governmental level, businesses are able to wield this control over capital and investment as a way of coercing and limiting what government officials are able to do. They also provide a large portion of tax revenue for government. So that's one other way in which government becomes dependent upon the tax revenues coming from business. So in the book, we document a lot of the routine threats of disinvestment that capitalists engage in response to government policy. So typically, whenever a business, a CEO or whatever, dislikes the reforms that government officials are contemplating or trying to enact, they'll routinely threaten to withdraw investments. And we've all heard this, that the consequence of implementing X or Y regulation is going to be loss of jobs, higher prices for consumers, the drying up of credit, the drying up of investment in general. So this becomes a way of strong-arming government into doing what business wants. And we see this at kind of at a more micro level in employers that are faced with unionization or demands from their employees. So particularly in the case of manufacturers, it's very common to hear from employers who are facing a unionization campaign that they're going to simply outsource production or offshore production in response to workers' demands. And sometimes they actually go forward and do that. So a similar kind of principle applies at the level of government, we argue. And so the consequence of this is that a primary goal of government officials, politicians and regulators and everyone else, becomes the maintenance and the advancement of what's often called business confidence. Keeping business confident enough in the government so that the controllers of capital will continue to invest that capital and therefore allow for economic stability. Most of the book, this portion of the book anyways, is based on the Barack Obama era, both because we were, as scholars rooted in the United States, we are, my two co-authors and I, were most familiar with the US context, and because it's a really interesting case of a candidate who came into office with a lot of progressive promises, a lot of progressive campaign elements. And yet, over the 8 years of his presidency, proved to be pretty disappointing to a lot of his earlier supporters. So there's this real sharp disjunction between the promises of Obama as a candidate and the actual policy outcomes. And this is not to single out Obama, because he's certainly not unique in this regard. But it is a particularly interesting case of, or particularly acute case of the gulf between the rhetoric and the policy outcomes. So we look at the importance of capital disinvestment in shaping the Obama administration's policies. And obviously, Obama was coming into office right basically at the start of the Great Recession. 2008, 2009, and this is a disinvestment crisis of historic proportions. So much of the administration's focus becomes on how to restart investment by Wall Street, by the financial sector, and also by non-financial corporations who were sitting on trillions of dollars in cash, unused cash that was not being invested in productive ventures, not generating employment, not going out to consumers and businesses in the form of loans. So just to give you an idea of the scale, by 2016, the last full year of Obama's presidency, there was $9.25 trillion in cash literally lying unused in banks, in non-financial companies, money market funds, other sources of capital that were essentially lying fallow, not being invested productively. So this is a tremendous level of disinvestment, and business at every step in the game business leaders were using this as a lever to try to get the policies that they wanted from Obama, saying that, we will invest this money when government does X, Y, and Z, when government cuts taxes for corporations, when it finalizes these, neoliberal trade and investment deals with foreign nations, those kinds of things. So this goes a long way toward explaining the record of the Obama presidency, and by extension, why the policy outcomes under so many progressive political leaders turn out to be disappointing to so many people. Now, of course, we also want to understand how movements can be most effective in response to this structural power of capital, the structural power of obstruction that the capitalist class has. And our answer is that, we are very skeptical of the conventional wisdom that emphasizes, at least in the United States context, the conventional wisdom emphasizes a politician-centric kind of political strategy. We need to elect different politicians. We need to lobby or perhaps protest against the politicians when they're in office to try to get the policy reforms that we want. So we're skeptical of that conventional strategy. And that skepticism flows in part from the analysis of business power itself, because capitalist political power is not fundamentally dependent on elections. Then even if we do manage to win an election, even if a progressive candidate does manage to win, which is a big if, given all of the structural and financial barriers to that happening, then we're still going to be faced with these very formidable obstacles to real policy change. So what might a different might a more comprehensive social movement strategy look like? So to answer that question, we look at some of the historical case studies of classic movement victories in the US context from the last century. So, there are cases that will be familiar to many people, at least in the United States. The upsurge of worker movements, workers and unemployed workers as well in the 1930s. That's one case that we look at, and specifically the passage of the Wagner Act, or the National Labor Relations Act, in 1935, and the way that that was implemented. That's the first major case study that we look at. We also look at some of the movements from the 1960s, specifically the Black freedom movements, the movement against racial segregation and for economic justice in the 1960s. And then we also look at the movement against the war in Vietnam, the US movement, and we analyze why the US withdrawal eventually came about. So in each of these cases, we sort of challenge some of the conventional explanations for how these movements were successful. The primary focus of movement activists in each of these cases, and the primary focus of most of the people in these movements, was not electoral or legislative in nature. Instead, it was organizing to take collective action that directly disrupted the operations of usually economic elites and to some extent political elites as well. So usually this took the form of withholding labor, collectively withholding labor and or money. So we're talking especially here about strikes and other forms of labor disruption and boycotts, economically speaking. And that was especially, the boycotts were especially important in the case of the Southern Civil Rights Movement in the early 60s. So just a couple of words about each case. So the Wagner Act in 1935 was really possible. The passage of it was really possible because there was a prior upsurge of worker unrest, worker organizing and disruption, including lots of strikes in the early 1930s. And this is a piece that we actually don't go into detail very much about in the book. But if we were to expand that case study, we would need to talk a little bit more about the early 30s, because that's a piece of the history that often gets neglected. It's not as if the Wagner Act was passed and then it catalyzed or emboldened all of these workers to then fight for their rights on the job, which is the narrative that we often hear in the historical literature. But there were many strikes that preceded the passage of the Wagner Act. And then after the Wagner Act was passed, worker initiative on the shop floor, in the factories and other workplaces was essential to actually getting that act implemented, because the legislation passed by Congress was initially ignored for about 2 years by employers. And there was no way for government to really enforce that legislation on employers. So by 1937, though, there was a tremendous new cycle of strikes that essentially forced large employers like General Motors and US Steel to conclude that they're better off accepting the new legislation and accepting the unionization of their workforce than continuing to oppose it. So the National Labor Relations Act and the unionization of their workers becomes, from the point of the capitalists, a lesser evil. And that's really what our argument is about in terms of social movement strategy, the way that social movements can force elites to accept major progressive reform as a lesser evil option, as a way of ending the disruption and restoring stability. So we apply a similar analysis to the 1960s with the civil rights movement, the movement for anti-poverty funding through the so-called War on Poverty, and then the movement against the Vietnam War. And for sake of time, I won't go into more detail there, but I'll just highlight one quotation from Martin Luther King Jr. speaking in the aftermath of the Birmingham, Alabama civil rights campaign of 1963. And he said later that year that he was reflecting on the reasons why the campaign was successful. And he said that the political power structure listens to the economic power structure. And he was referring there specifically to the way that the white supremacist political power structure in the South, the police forces, the mayors, the city councils, the judges, basically were subordinate to the economic elites in the South and in the North. So they basically took orders from the economic elite at the end of the day. And it was the political elites who were the most recalcitrant, most reactionary forces. It was the economic elites, in the case of Birmingham, the downtown business merchants, the real estate owners, and so on, who were the first to capitulate to the movement's demands. Why? Because they faced disruption to their businesses in the form of boycotts and marches and sit-ins and all of that really severely hampered their profits. So after about 5 weeks of that disruption in Birmingham, the business elites basically capitulated and went to the political elites and said, you need to integrate, right? We need racial integration as a way of restoring stability. So that's what Martin Luther King was reflecting on. So I'll kind of stop there with the case studies, and I'll just say a word about the conclusion of the book. We're also trying to draw out some of the larger lessons for social movements here, and the conclusion offers some reflections on this old leftist question about reform and revolution, right? Because we're not just interested in small reforms, we want major systemic transformation here. So the focus of most of the book, though, is on the way that reform struggles can be successful. But we think that there's a relationship here to the larger, more ambitious and systemic revolutionary goals that many of us have in mind, because we need to build the mass movements that are going to be able to make the the more ambitious changes possible. So in the conclusion, we reflect on that question, how reform-oriented movements can perhaps become the building blocks for something that goes beyond just reform. So I'll leave it there. I think my time is about up for this segment, so let's go on to the rest.
Thanks very much, Kevin. That was an incredible overview of the book. I just want to say to the audience more broadly, thanks to Fabian for organizing this. He and I are together in a reading group with a bunch of other people in Amsterdam, and we read the book, and we enjoyed it a lot. And we developed a couple of questions based on the text that sort of we were triggered by some of the claims that you make. So the first question that we have is about disruptive action. So in the book, you argue for disruptive and sustained mass action that threatens the interests of the elite. As you put it in your presentation, it can alter their cost-benefit analysis, and this in turn drives legislative reform. Now, my question is, what kind of disruptive mass movement most directly threatens elite institutions? What form of disruptive action should we be engaging in if we want to bring about systemic change? Are there any kind of general insights that you've developed?
Yeah, but my general answer to that is that withholding labor and or money are the classic forms, right? Withholding the resources on which elites depend, right? Their power comes essentially from their ability to withhold the resources that we depend on. So to the extent that we can withhold the resources that they depend on in the form of labor, power, and money, we will be most powerful in countering their power. So the classic forms would be the labor strike or other forms of disruption to the labor process, slow down, stick outs, those kinds of things. And the consumer counterpart is traditionally the boycott. Now, if we define these concepts more expansively, they could include other kinds of collective action as well. Tenants engaging in a rent strike, debtors going on strike against their creditors, divestment campaigns targeting war profiteers or fossil fuel companies, counter recruitment efforts in the case of militaries, as well as employers. There's been some interesting counter recruitment efforts in the fossil fuel and financial industries in the United States, targeting youth to try to disrupt, as some of the climate activists that I've talked to, they talk about disrupting the recruitment pipeline. So I think that that's an interesting approach. So these all kind of fall within the same broad category of denying the labor power and the money that elite interests depend upon. Now, it's challenging to organize the degree of coherence and unity and cohesion to be able to carry out these actions, right? It's easier to do something like, knocking on doors and talking to people about a political candidate. There's a reason why that is the kind of default political strategy in so many places, because it's less daunting. Organizing a major labor strike is not easy to do. It takes a lot of organizing work, education, agitation, one-on-one conversations over time that prepare people to come together around their common interests and take collective action. But at the same time, the payoff from that kind of action is much bigger. So I think that we need to be building the organizations that can be that can ultimately prepare people to take that kind of collective action. So in the cases that we look at, take the example of the civil rights movement, the boycotts that were so important to the civil rights movement, and that's the boycotts are actually a piece that often gets neglected, really doesn't get talked about very much, just how central the boycott as a tactic was to the Southern Civil Rights Movement in the US. It was absolutely central. But they didn't just materialize out of thin air. MLK didn't just snap his fingers and declare a boycott. The boycotts were carried out in very meticulous fashion by community organizers, and building upon the prior organizational foundations in places like Montgomery, Alabama, and Birmingham. So one of the sub-themes in the book is actually about the kinds of organizational structures that can be most conducive to carrying out this, to building this collective capacity and carrying out these kinds of actions. So we talk a little bit, it's not really the central theme of the book, but we do talk a little bit about the need for organizational democracy, which we define not just as having internal elections within an organization, but maybe more importantly, as the participation of the membership at large in the crafting of strategies. And this is something that has been important in many social movements, many of the cases that we look at too, like in the 1930s. Those movements were actually very decentralized, such that workers on the assembly line at a General Motors factory, because of the nature of the assembly line production system, workers anywhere in the plant could potentially stop production and disrupt the entire process. So I think it's important, applying that lesson today, that it's important that members within an organization have meaningful participation in the sense of being able to initiate, try out particular tactics and forms of action. And then if those things are successful, they'll catch on elsewhere. And that was a big reason why the movements of the 30s and the 60s succeeded, because local activists tried out particular kinds of action. They either succeeded or they failed. And then movements elsewhere learned those lessons. So that process of organizational learning and diffusion of lessons within movements are very important. And we argue that one of the ways to accelerate that process is to provide, to build organizational structures that encourage that kind of trial and error and experimentation and collective learning, which we group together under that idea of organizational democracy. So I say all of that as a response to your question, but there's one big caveat which I want to offer, which is that it's impossible to try to offer any sort of specific blueprint for what movement strategy is going to look like. I can't do that, and I don't think any book could do that. And I think it's dangerous to try to be too specific about what movement strategies can or should look like today, because in each of these historical cases, movements did have to proceed through trial and error, and they did have to arrive at the best strategies through that process of experimentation and collective learning, right? It wasn't just a strategy that was being articulated by, some intellectual in the academy or some singular organizer somewhere. In the civil rights movement, it wasn't just MLK who was strategizing and coming up with these grand plans that allowed for the movement to succeed. It was a much more bottom-up construction of the strategy. So I think that we need organizations that can be creative, that can be agile, and flexible.
Yeah, thanks for that very comprehensive answer. And as you rightly point out, every age has its own problems and its own ways of responding to those. I want to press you on an issue that you discuss in the book. So you argue that most successful movements search for potential fault lines among elites, and you've touched on that in your presentation. But can you tell us a little bit more about how this works in practice, how to find these fault lines between different elite groups, and how historically movements have utilized this as one of the levers of power?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to go back to the civil rights movement, I think this is one of the clearest examples. So I briefly alluded to the division between political and economic elites in places like Birmingham, Alabama. And, this was not a an overt conflict prior to the early 60s. The economic and political elite were basically, moving in harmony with one another. They were both supportive of integration. Even the, relatively liberal, genteel, economic elites in places like Birmingham were supportive, or at least tolerant, of the atmosphere of racial terrorism against Black people. And it took the movement's disruptive and sustained action to bring the economic elite around to the point where they decided that capitulation to the movement was the lesser evil option. So the movement itself induced that split, that conflict between the economic power structure and the political elites in the South, and basically pit those two interests against one another. So you have the real estate leaders and downtown business merchants in Birmingham who were the first to favor concessions to the movement in May of 1963. So I think that that's an important example of how movements can help to produce those fissures, those conflicts. But by targeting elites who are more vulnerable to the movement's pressures, which the business elite was, or at least the business elites that depended on local consumption and local investment and investment from the North. Not all business elites were so vulnerable. The planter aristocracy was not vulnerable to movement pressures in the same way, but some of the urban merchants were, and the urban real estate interests and financial interests were vulnerable. So I think that the general lesson is that movements need to think about how to target those groups within the elite who are most vulnerable, most susceptible to pressure, who can be brought around most easily to favoring the reforms that the movement wants, and who are also powerful enough to be able to impose those changes on their counterparts within the elite class. So in the case of Birmingham, that was the particular interests that I talked about. There's something very similar that happens actually much more recently. About a decade ago, in 2010, the state of Arizona in the United States, and I think maybe there was somebody from Arizona that I saw in the chat. The state of Arizona passed this anti-immigrant legislation, SB 1070, that actually required police to racially profile with the goal of detaining and deporting immigrants, undocumented immigrants. And in response to that legislation, there was this nationwide, actually international in scope, boycott of the state of Arizona. And any businesses that were operating in Arizona, even the company Arizona Iced Tea got a bad name. And what happened is that the business elites in Arizona that were dependent on this outside trade and investment, whose interests were being harmed by the boycott, went to the state legislature, which was Republican dominated, and they said, you need to stop passing these anti-immigrant laws because our business interests are suffering. And they actually succeeded in stopping this whole new wave of anti-immigrant laws that was being proposed. And we see similar examples in other US states as well, with regard to anti-LGBT legislation and various racist legislation. So that's a similar example of how the movement induced this split between economic and political elites. And I'm especially interested in thinking about how we might apply this lesson to the climate movement. So I have some initial thoughts, and I think that it would require us to think about potential conflicts within the capitalist class. The capitalist class as a whole does not have a unified position on the climate emergency. There are particular elites who could be more vulnerable to our pressures. And the movement around the world has been focusing a lot in recent years on the financial sector, the banks, the insurance companies, the asset managers, private equity, and so on, and also employers and other large institutions that control pools of capital, pension funds, asset owners, universities, and so on. And these institutions are all of these institutions are harmed to some extent by climate destruction. So they all have some material interest in confronting fossil fuels, confronting the fossil fuels sector. And I think it's a really important question that we need to think about is what will it take to bring these other elite sectors into confrontation with fossil fuels. And that's essentially what the project that I'm working on right now is about. I know at the end you were going to ask me about my current and recent work.
Carry on. I feel like we're there. We've reached that point. I was going to ask you, like, what can we take from levers of power and how can we apply it to the climate crisis? I mean, what are you working on at the moment that we can learn from? And this is my last question, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. So please start thinking about that.
So I'm sure that others in the audience will have thoughts on this question, but I'm essentially trying to figure out how the movement can be most effective in generating these conflicts within the capitalist class, and also between state elites and fossil fuel industry interests. So I'm trying to look at the recent history of climate struggles in the U.S. and Canada, and some battles against pipelines and power plants, and drilling projects and so on, and trying to figure out, in the case of successful campaigns against particular projects, what has allowed those campaigns to be successful, and how have movements generated pressure on particular segments of capital or particular state officials. And essentially the argument that I'm tossing around in my head is has a lot to do with the importance of targeting the financial sector, and also certain kinds of state elites. And actually politicians, in my analysis, turn out not to be the most important in most cases. The more important state officials, in my estimation, are actually regulators and judges. So litigation and lawsuits have a very important role to play in conjunction with the more overtly disruptive movement tactics of protests, civil disobedience, and financial targeting of the financial sector through divestment, through negative publicity campaigns, disruptive actions targeting the banks and the insurance companies and everything else. So and then there's another important question that I think we could develop more, which is about how to target employers and what role could labor unions be playing. The labor movement in the U.S. is much weaker than it used to be, but there are still sectors of the economy that are still highly unionized. If we look at education, healthcare, electrical workers, which are very strategic labor sector for any sort of decarbonization. These are relatively well unionized sectors that could, in principle, carry out very important collective action on behalf of decarbonization and climate justice. So I think that it's worth thinking about what we could do to try to organize the capacity to be able to carry out that sort of action. So I guess I'll leave it there. I want to leave as much time as possible for people to chime in.
Let's have some questions. So if you have a question and you want to ask it yourself, just use the raise hand function and we'll get to you. But to kick things off, we'll start with Hans-Peter's question. He asked in the chat, how would you consider democracy not equal to elections, but democracy equal to random selection? So I suppose he means selection by lot, to a random selection of a representative sample of civil society. This framing would put both the assumptions and the conclusions about the 99% influence, past, present, and in principle, in a completely different light. Thanks. Yeah, so perhaps should we replace democracy with some kind of ancient Greek system of selecting people by lot? What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. I think it's certainly interesting, and I've read a little bit about. It's not really my field, but I've read a little bit about the alternative systems for democratic decision making, like a deliberative democracy model, in which delegates come together and are educated around an issue and kind of arrive at something which is going to take various stakeholder interests into account. And I think that that would certainly be an improvement upon the system that we have now, which in the U.S. the general population is essentially completely disenfranchised, not formally, but de facto, in terms of the actual influence that people have, the influence that, say, the bottom 80 or 90% of the population by income has over the political process, which is virtually zero statistical correlation between the policy preferences of that bottom 80% or so and what actually the policies that actually come out on the other side. I think that my hesitancy around the system that you're describing might be that I think that random selection to me does not seem like it would be the most responsive and accountable potential form. I think that when it comes to decision-making power, the principle that appeals to me is that the people who are most affected by a particular policy have the most input into the determination of that policy. So, for instance, on something like gay marriage, I don't think that the heterosexual population should be given as much weight in the decision-making as the non-heterosexual population, because it just doesn't affect them. So I think that the random selection, that's where I'm a little bit wary about the idea of random selection, but it probably would be an improvement on what we have now.
Okay, thanks. We'll go to a live question from Troy's hand, I think went up first. Go ahead, Troy.
Hi, thanks very much for what you're talking about here. It just seems so consistent with what we're doing in Phoenix, Arizona. We have a Extinction Rebellion, Scientist Rebellion has a campaign against Wells Fargo bank branches. Wells Fargo seems to us to be the most vulnerable of the banks that finance fossil fuel. They have the highest percentage of customers versus the other three large banks that are funding fossil fuels. Easy access to banks, very easy to disrupt, and we're trying to disrupt their customers and their money. Does that seem like a good strategy to you, and how might we improve on that strategy?
Yeah, thank you, Troy. That sounds excellent. I'm really happy to hear about that. And I think that I've been involved in trying to kind of get some of those campaigns started where I am in Western Massachusetts as well, and at the state level. And I think that certainly all of the negative publicity that we can generate about these banks' investment decisions and underwriting decisions is important, and the individual level action is important. I would say that, to the extent that we can take that up to a higher level of collective municipal and state level action, it's going to be more powerful. So, for instance, getting our city councils and municipal level governments to cut ties with these banks or these insurance companies, the way that the Seattle City Council in 2017 did with Wells Fargo over Wells Fargo's funding of the Dakota Access Pipeline. So that's maybe the best example that I know of in the U.S. context of a municipal government taking on one of the big banks. So, and that was a significant amount of capital that when Seattle closed its account with Wells Fargo, something like $4 billion. So, not trivial, and it got a lot of attention. And I think if more local governments and institutions like labor unions, religious institutions, and so on, were to do this, I think it could be very powerful. And I think that the divestment movement traditionally has been more focused on divestment of fossil fuel stock holdings. But in recent years, it's, I think, really expanded more to also target the financial sector. And I think that there's a lot of promise there, targeting the banks and also the insurers. I have a lot of optimism about the potential for targeting insurance companies. Because in the insurance, just to say this as briefly as possible, the insurance market is, for many of the fossil fuel operations, is more concentrated than with banking. If a bank divests from a sector, there's still a lot of other potential sources of capital that fossil fuel operations companies can draw upon. With insurance, it is a more concentrated market. And if you block access to insurance, if insurance companies decide to exit a particular sector, as they largely have with the coal sector, and as they're starting to do with oil and gas, the fossil fuel companies really don't have another option. They have to have insurance. If they don't have insurance, they can't get the financing. So I would say that the insurance companies are also really important to target.
Thanks for that question, Troy. We'll go to a linked question that was posted in the chat, and then we'll go back to live. So Sana and Max have a kind of linked question. So Sana asks, as more and more experts on the environment, economy, and sociology are pointing out that we have to abolish the whole growth economy, that is the whole current economic system, is it possible to achieve the needed system change by withholding labor, power, and money? After all, the whole idea is to permanently get rid of a big part of labor, power, and money. And then Max links to that. He says, the most urgent and necessary step towards broad system change seems to be shutting down fossil fuel industries. Is there any precedent for social movements seeking a change at that type of scale? And then here I want to use my privilege as a moderator to kind of add another twist to that question. So in your discussion of the civil rights movement, you talked about business owners in urban areas facing pressure from activists, and they kind of put pressure on the elites. But those businesses continued to operate as time passed and new legislation was passed. But when it comes to the fossil fuel industry, as is pointed out by these questions, ideally they should be dismantled and disbanded completely. And so they have a very different set of incentives. There is simply no way for them to adapt themselves to a kind of changing reality. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, these are all great questions and so important. So thank you for these. Part of what we talk about in the book, although really at the end of it, is about the limitations of reform. When we talk about withholding labor, power, and money, it is possible that sort of collective action could give way to a kind of revolutionary system change. It has in certain historical cases. If we look at, there's examples of world revolutions, of course, in which mass strikes were very important. The Russian Revolution, for instance. In the U.S. context, one of the cases that I think is especially interesting is the abolition of racial slavery in the 1860s, which did involve a very important, of course, there was, civil war, but as part of that conjuncture in the early 1860s, there was effectively a mass general strike of enslaved people, fleeing the plantations, joining the Union Army. So the withdrawal of labor power was very important. And in terms of the liquidation or the systemic transformation, I think that in U.S. history, that's maybe the closest that we have to a systemic change, where you have legal chattel slavery abolished, right? And not that it was, not that what came after by the end of Reconstruction was, a just economy or true liberation in any sense. There was, forms of new forms of labor subordination and racial subordination, as we know. But the legal system of slavery was dismantled, and very quickly. So I think that there's some precedent for that. And I agree, to skip forward to Harriet's question about the fossil fuel industries. I agree. I think that in times of crisis, it's a great opportunity for governments to nationalize fossil fuel industries and basically wind them down, liquidate them. There was an opportunity to do that in 2020 with the crash in oil prices and the weakness of the fossil fuel companies. There was a similar opportunity with the Great Recession, with some of the industries that entered into crisis, like the U.S. auto industry. I think the U.S. government could have come in and nationalized, as it effectively did nationalize, but without really assuming control and without really restructuring the industry in the way that it needed to be restructured. But it could have put the industry in the hands of the workers. It could have retooled those auto industries so that they produce, that they're geared toward mass transit and electric vehicles to some extent. So, that was a big missed opportunity that emerged in the context of this crisis. But I think that is something we need to be demanding. And it's something that is certainly not outside of the power of government to do. To take another historical example, which many of you I'm sure know about, is World War II economic conversion. This was a scale of economic conversion. It wasn't, overthrowing the capitalist system, but it was effectively introducing these structures of command and control by the U.S. government in order to counter the threat of a rival imperial power. And this was a drastic and very rapid overhaul of the U.S. economy. And incidentally, it involved a much higher level of spending as a percentage of GDP than we need to be able to decarbonize the economy today. Now, not saying decarbonization in itself is the answer to everything. It'll deal with the most urgent manifestation of the problem, which is carbon emissions. It's not going to bring about total environmental sustainability, but this goes back to the question about, are reforms going to be enough? And I think in this case, we urgently need these big reforms while continuing to organize and build movements that can go beyond the reforms. Because reforms in themselves, historically speaking, have been unstable. Reforms within this context of a capitalist system are unstable. They're going to be subject to constant erosion and undermining by vested interests. We see this in the case of labor laws, in the case of even civil rights laws and voting rights laws, constantly being eroded because it hasn't really been a fundamental systemic change that came out of the 1930s and the 1960s. It was just reform. So I think I addressed it. I think there's more to say.
There was a lot to unpack there, but I think you did. We'll go back to a question in person from, I think it's Sunny, Debt for Climate, SR, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm Sunny Morgan. I'm with Debt for Climate and Extinction Rebellion and Scientist Rebellion in South Africa. So I want to focus on something that Kevin was talking about and the role of boycotts, sanctions, and divestment, particularly to bring about change. So I mentioned I'm from South Africa, and we overthrew the system of apartheid in South Africa, specifically. Boycotts and divestment featured prominently in that campaign. It was part of various parts of the campaign, but boycotts serve the fundamental purpose and helped to isolate the apartheid regime from capital and major corporations in the United States and in Europe divested, and that sent the economic signal that you talk about in the book. So there must be a unique set of circumstances that make that possible, because if we talk about a similar campaign that the Palestinians use against the Israelis at the moment, that's not working as effectively as it worked in South Africa. So I haven't read the book, and I will be getting a copy shortly, is to ask if boycotts, divestment, and sanctions serve a specific purpose, what are the set of circumstances that need to be present for that to happen? And then allied to that is to take it down to climate activism. So we have a campaign similar to the Wells Fargo campaign here, where we have targeted the largest bank in the country called Standard Bank. They refer to as Stanbic in the rest of Africa, to target them specifically because they're a major funder of the East African crude oil pipeline that's going to go through a number of countries in Africa, Uganda, Tanzania, and that. So we target them very, very specifically. When we say we target them with various campaigns, letter writing campaigns, but we physically pitch up every quarter, maybe every 2 months at their head office. And this idea of the threat of boycotts by getting their customers hasn't seemed to move them. So it goes back to the question of what circumstances need to be prevalent, or that we can capitalize on, or that we can support to bring about this change that we're talking about. And then I'll close with this observation, that your idea of insurance companies also in the crude oil, in the ECOP, Stop ECOP campaign, we have successfully through campaigns around the world. We are now on the 22nd or 23rd insurance company that has pulled out of financing, of covering the transaction. But every time we stop that, now we're on the 23rd insurance company that has pulled out. There's 24, 25, 26, and 27 standing in the queue. So that's also the issue, that we're not being effective because the system is so big that somebody just stops doing that. It's also in Australia with the Carmichael mine. Their insurance companies are, I think, probably double digit already that have pulled out, but the mine's still going ahead. So this idea that boycotts inherently work as it did in the apartheid regime and it did in the civil rights movement, it doesn't seem to work in the current context of the economy of 2022, 2021. So what are we missing?
Yeah, wow, such a great question, Sunny, and it's inspiring and illuminating to hear about your work in South Africa. What are the circumstances that make for successful boycott and divestment campaigns? A few initial thoughts that I have. So, first of all, I think that these tactics are not silver bullets, and they shouldn't be treated as such. And they're not. They shouldn't be used in isolation from other sorts of pressure tactics and strategies. So in cases where I think that there's also a danger here in potentially diverting too much of our resources into boycott campaigns if it means neglecting other forms of capacity building. So I'll give just one example of that. I'm not saying that that's happening in the climate movement necessarily, but in the United Farm Worker boycotts in the 1960s and 70s in the United States, they had very effective boycott campaigns targeting consumers, the consumers of fruits and vegetables. The downside of that, though, was that the diversion of the organization's resources into organizing those boycotts did take away resources from organizing the workers themselves in the fields. So that's just one point of caution. I think that boycotts do need to be used in conjunction with other tactics. I think the contrast between Palestine and South Africa is interesting, and there's some you surely know more about this than I do, but there's some potential differences here in terms of the position of capital in South Africa versus Palestine. I think that the South African business elites, they needed Black labor in the way that business in Palestine does not need Palestinian labor in the same way. At least that's one contrast that Noam Chomsky often raises, thinking about BDS in the case of Palestine. So I guess there's plenty more to say, but those are just some initial thoughts. I don't know if you have any thoughts in response to what I said, Sonny.
Thanks, Kevin. Sonny, did you want to say something very briefly? Because we've reached 5 o'clock already, at least 5 o'clock where I am. No?
Yeah, let me just say, I would love to be in touch. Anybody who wants to be in touch with me, I would love to hear more from you and dialogue a little bit more about these things. So I'm dropping my email in the chat now. But I really appreciate all of your thoughts and contributions here.
Thanks, Kevin. That's very generous. We'll go then to one more question online, and if anybody else has a final question and willing to raise their hand, please do so. We'll go to a last question from Terry. So Terry says, the recent action by President Biden to force railroad workers to accept an agreement their majority didn't want appears to be contrary evidence, suggesting that capitalist elites hold the levers of government power firmly enough to disempower the collective bargaining process when it threatens their grip on those levers of power. So this is in response to the recent potential strike by rail workers in the US and Biden's intervention in that. What are your thoughts on this, Kevin?
I'm not entirely sure I understood the question aspect of it. I agree with the analysis that I heard. Maybe if you could say it one more time.
So I think the question is that the fact that Biden seems to be forcing an agreement on these union members indicates that the elites have their hands so firmly on the levers of power that they can't be dislodged using sort of normal collective action. Yeah, I think that's it. You know, that okay. Perhaps something even more militant is needed.
Yeah, I would say that, well, I think this example does point to the limitations of electoral and legislative pressure tactics. That, you know, there has not been a railroad workers strike. There's, you know, the danger of it, the threat of it, but hasn't actually been carried out. It is, you know, a potential form of disruptive action that workers could try, and we'll see if that is attempted. But, you know, it's often the case that political administrations, even the relatively liberal parties like the Democrats, will side with business over workers. And, you know, this example in particular is a very ominous precedent for government strike busting in potentially other sectors as well. So the question is, how is the labor movement as a whole going to respond? How are the railway workers going to respond? And in the current project that I'm working on, I'm looking a lot at an example of coal miners in the United States in the 60s and 1970s. Coal miners, you know, often today get a very bad rap in the climate movement as being kind of reactionary instruments of the fossil fuel sector. But, you know, they have a very militant labor history, including in the United States, really all over the world, but including in the United States. And in 1969, they waged two major political strikes, political in the sense that they were going on strike against government to try to force government to pass legislation on Black lung disease, to improve safety standards in the mines, and to offer compensation to disabled miners and their families. And they won those strikes. And this is one of the few examples from US labor history of workers actually going on strike, not just over purely economic causes against their employers, but going on strike to force a government to do something. And these were illegal strikes, not sanctioned by the official Union International. And in the 1970s, they continued to go on wildcat strikes in defiance of court injunctions. So the willingness to defy laws and politician actions and judicial actions is an important piece of actually all of the movements that I mentioned. Many of, I didn't highlight this in the presentation, but most of the movements that I've described relied very heavily on actions that were technically illegal, including defiance of judicial injunctions, including federal injunctions against strike activity. So the willingness and the capacity to defy those legislative and judicial constraints is an important ingredient for movement success. And it's obviously easier said than done. It requires a high level of consciousness and organizational unity and coherence. And that's just to go back to Sunny's question before about the conditions that make boycott successful. I think that they do rely upon that level of coherence and that level of broad-based consciousness about the need for that kind of action. I think that that's the kind of capacity that we need to be building in our movements all the time, with an eye toward being able to carry out that kind of action. It's not something that can be achieved quickly, but it does have a huge payoff when we actually pull it off.
Yeah, it's a long road. We'll have one last question in person from Ignas.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I was wondering about this lesser evil alternative for capital owners, and the examples that you brought up, where this affected legislation that influenced the business's operation was in time when capital was much less mobile than it is today. So the lesser evil might be withdraw capital from the country where you have those strikes, for instance, which could have an effect of maybe turning a part of the public that lost their jobs against the climate movement, having maybe some difficult secondary effect. And those examples from recent times touch rather the legislation that didn't touch businesses operations at all. So do you see how we cope with this difficulty in in modern times of legislation that touches or is supposed to touch the way businesses operate and their ability to withdraw capital, and how to go about this as a social movement? Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so really important. So there's always a threat of capital flight or capital strike in opposition to things that business doesn't like. But I would say that not all sectors of capital are equally able to employ that weapon. So the education sector, for instance, or transportation or healthcare, service sectors, it's harder for certain sectors of capital to go on strike against their workers or against government because their capital is less mobile. Right. Then, in the case of financial capital or, many kinds of manufacturing, they have a higher degree of mobility. So I think that some of the most promising disruptive movement efforts do target the relatively stationary sectors of capital that don't have that power to pick up and move quite so easily. And thinking about some of the strikes in recent US history, one of the most active sectors has been education. And it's not a mass production sector, at least in the conventional sense. We can talk about the mass production of students, but it is very economically disruptive at the same time, right? It doesn't directly disrupt production when educators go on strike, but it does disrupt indirectly by keeping parents home from work and forcing them to take time off from their jobs, which has ripple effects across the whole economy. And we've seen this in some of the ways that politicians have responded to some of the educator strikes in California and West Virginia and so on. You know, the possibility of capital flight is real, but there are also limitations to that weapon.
Okay, well, on that note, we will end today's discussion. Thank you very much, Kevin, for joining us here to discuss your book, and it was incredible to hear about your new research as well. Thank you, Fabian, for organizing and being the director. And thank you to everybody for joining today and for the great questions. And this talk has been recorded, and we will make it available on the Scientist Rebellion channel. So you can share it with anybody who had to miss it. Yes. That's it. Thanks, everyone. Have a lovely evening further.
Thank you so much, everybody. And feel free to be in touch.